Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first GPP recap show of the year. NBA has not started yet, which means special guest Drew Dinkmeyer is able to join me, and we'll punt at him until down the line when NBA starts. So thank you for joining me, Drew.
Yeah, glad to be here. Glad to recap a bloody day in the GPP streets for me, as the chalk hit quite strong.
Yeah, it was a chalk smash, and I think let's start with ownership right off the bat. I've got up the ownership from the slant, which our ownership projections are for the Millie Maker, but they're always more correlated to the slant because people are playing projections a bit more, and there's just some more variance with the casuals and the Millie Maker. So I feel like this is probably the best approximation of how our ownership did. We had, a 94.5% correlation. That's an R squared of 89%, which is like, okay, there's a lot of guys that are going to project low and come in low that like inflate that number a little bit. But overall, I was pretty happy with it. We can see the highest owned players right off the bat. Kelsey scores 29, Pittman scores 30, CMC, Marquise Brown, and Juju were bad, but then Saquon goes nuts, Justin Jefferson goes nuts. And it is pretty spread out, Drew, as you noted to me that the ownerships in the Millie are spread out. And I think Gary had a good article. Definitely check out his GPP leverage article. He's got much better handle than me in terms of playing MME and how to deal with these spread out ownerships, because it's a much different thing than when you're playing, the smaller fields. And, some of these guys here get squeezed down a little bit, and then some of these other guys get like way inflated.
Yeah. And if you just kind of look positionally, right? Like, okay, the top tight end scored 29. The top owned wide receiver scored 30. The second highest owned running back scored 36. The second highest owned wide receiver scored 42. The highest owned defense scored 18. The first highest owned quarterback scored 25, and the second highest owned scored 38. So like that is a lot of chalk hitting all at once. Now, chalk can be different based on the contest you play, and this is what you're alluding to. So in the slant here, right, like Patrick Mahomes was the second highest owned quarterback, but at 12%, I don't think there's any issue playing him at 12%, like
no, there's, I did want to talk about the KC stuff a little bit, but there's the quarterback stuff. And I think we kind of hit on this in the Millies. Like, I didn't really care in the large field.
Yeah.
Play whoever you want.
Yep.
The small field, I didn't want to run in, and I ended up playing Hurts. And Mahomes really got steamed in the small field, but I didn't want to play Hurts at like 30 if all the other elite quarterbacks were going to be 10. But I think, in large field, it doesn't matter too much. It was also one of those days where I set myself up to swap into that late chalk, but it didn't go well enough early with Pittman really smashing, that it was just hard for me to justify swapping it into that. There were a lot of clean teams out there that I couldn't do that. But I do think on the KC stuff, what was interesting is it did seem like that game stack propelled everyone up. Mahomes in some of the stuff I played was even higher owned than Hurts, and by a decent margin at times. And we had kind of, when we did our ownership projections, we had propped up some of the Philly wide receivers, just worried that, because a couple of times last year when we missed on ownership, like that was the case. It was like chalk quarterback carries, but that didn't really happen. And that was frustrating because AJ Brown at like 10% is a really good play.
Yeah.
You can see Swift right above him, 10% good as part of the game stack. Amon-Ra 7%. Like that's actually, and Devonta's goose egg at 5%.
Sad.
But like that's actually really good. I played, I played a Hurt single in the 7-7-7 3 max. I played it with Devonta, but like if I knew AJ Brown was gonna be 9, I probably would have just played AJ Brown.
That's the thing, and that's the tricky part of all this. Can you go back to the slant ownership, and can you just sort by fantasy points? Filter that down.
Yeah, we can sort by fantasy points.
So I just want to note, like, there was almost no way to differentiate and catch up with the chalk. like basically, like if you just look at the highest scores on the slate, I mean,
you didn't play Carson Wentz?
No, I did not play Carson Wentz doubles. Carson Wentz doubles, man, with Wentz and Samuel and Dotson, that could have been fun. But just like looking like Cordell Patterson, Steelers D, those were ways. Burrow was solid. And then it's the guys who we thought were really good plays, but unclear on how much their ownership would go, right? Like Chase,
Hey,
Swift,
hey, someone was
AJ Brown.
flag planted Chase. Okay,
Yeah, but what I'm
so
saying is Chase ended up being like the fourth highest owned wide receiver on the
right, but
on the
it
slant.
was to your point, like in the MMU, it was spread. So at 12.5%, we don't really care if you're the
That
fourth
so,
or the
but
10th.
that's kind of my point. And so what I'm thinking now for like large field stuff is this going to hold? How condensed will the ownership be? Is it just going to be like 3 or 4 guys I need to be thoughtful on, and the rest I'm okay with? Or is it because I know in the stuff you play, it's more than 3 or 4 guys that you need to be thoughtful on because things can get really outsized in terms of the player pools.
Yeah, I think it's also just, understanding like the cumulative product of your ownership, which if guys are all 12%, like it's still pretty low.
Yeah.
They're the sum product of the ownership. But yeah, it was definitely a tough slate. Like and again, like not being able to swap into the chalk that hit like Barkley and the
Barkley, Jefferson,
Chase
Mahomes,
and
Kelsey.
right that and Jefferson like I had Chase and Jefferson. So I'll bring up. So this is a team I hand built one team for MME. It's gonna look like a weird team because it is a little bit of a weird team. But this is where I was like, I'm just playing the guys I think are best GPP plays based on ceiling and not super outsized ownership. And I'm not like overthinking the correlation. Because the other hard part in the small field, Drew, like when you stacked, if you did a game stack like Burrow stuff, your seconds, T. Higgins leaves with concussion. No one on Pittsburgh does anything.
Yeah.
Here I was able to I just played the Burrow single. I just said I'm gonna play the guys I think are best leverage. Played the Burrow single. This let me get in Jefferson. I couldn't get in Jefferson and other stuff because like if I'm playing Herbert and bringing back Devontae Adams, and Adams did great, but like I couldn't conceivably play Jefferson. So that was hard. I do think like when you get into MME, you can like restrict your rules and play something that's more like, let me just try and hit the parlay, like jamming these max ceiling. I don't know if this is correct, but I was like, this team has like basically all my favorite plays. So I'm gonna play it. I would never throw that in, like a 300 person contest because you really want to reduce the amount of things you get right and just kind of like accept your L's on a week like today in those contests.
And I think, looking back at all the stats that we pulled for the Millie Maker contest data and whatnot, we showed that there were edges on the stacking with the bringbacks, but they weren't the things that happened most frequently, So like when we say they're edges, it means that the teams that do this are finishing higher generally than the team than those that don't do this, but that doesn't mean that it's the majority of the time that happens. So like you're more likely to generate a top 100 team if you do a double stack and a bring back. But still 60% of the time or 65% of the time, whatever it was, the other top 100 teams are single stacks. You know what I mean? So you can still, or not stacked at all in some cases, which are really hard to hit those parlays. But it's to highlight the fact that you could build either way, and the edges that you're accumulating by doubles and bringbacks and things like that are still kind of on the periphery. You know what I mean? In terms of for a contest that's so much of the prize pool is at the very, very top.
Yeah, and you can see we did on the guys who are high scoring, most of them came in where we expected. The misses were Swift in the Detroit game and then the Steelers DST, and then some of the Hurts ownership went more to Mahomes than we expected. But for the most part, we were really on as far as like where we expected guys to be. CH was a really good play. And I was kind of happy with some of the running back pivot stuff. I had in the Thunderdome, I played CH and Connor. I was happy where their ownership came in. And again, I was set up to swap off those guys into the passing side of things if I had to. But with the Higgins getting crushed and Pickens getting crushed for me early, just couldn't do it. So just
and
was
the defense
hoping.
points you gave up early too.
Yeah,
the defense went nuts. The Bears defense did well.
Yeah, seeded a lot of points at defense. So, but yeah, this was one team I made, some mini correlations in there with the big, double stack from Burrow. Was pretty happy with what the Burrow double stack came in, honestly. And again, this was pretty small field. So like when you see 6.7%, I am one of two teams with those players. So if you remove that, it's low. Adams came in really low. And then I had another team, and like, again, mega small field, it's only a 10-person contest, but even still, just throwing the onslaught. Cobb is a guy that in high stakes came in, not just in this really small field, but other stuff. He came in a lot higher than I expected. So that was a bit of a miss. I was definitely not happy when the cards turned over late to have.
I mean, just imagine playing a Herbert triple and Keenan Allen gets hurt early and you get nothing out of it. Like, and he throws for almost 303, and you're just like, I captured a little piece of this.
It could on another day that could have panned out, but it wasn't today. On the Cobb part, the other part that was tough for me too, Drew, and again, going back to this team that was a little bit more balanced, was I could not find, and I even on this team have one of them, but I had a really tough time finding a way to like make like the mega balanced teams and avoid like those cheap receivers. And really the only cheap receiver that hurt you was like Dotson scoring 2 touchdowns on 3 catches. I think the rest really kind of tanked. If we look up top, we get this guy avoided the cheap wide receiver by just going double tight end. Robbie Anderson winning people $1 million. Like, his hit rate on winning people $1 million is really high because he did it twice last year. Starts off this year hot. But it's interesting that Baker team got there, but
that's great. That'll skew some data. That's wild.
So that this is the $100 million maker. This was a Baker single with, just kind of a mix of some low owned plays and some chalk.
No bring back either.
Yep. I played the Burrow single here with no bring back, but he gets the Jefferson chase in there. He hits on his stack where Baker doesn't put up a ton, but Robbie exceeds his expectation by so much that it gets there. And then he just kind of, gets that 2%. Patterson was huge. And then you're fine. Like, on a team like this, I'm not saying I would construct a team like this, but in terms of ownership percentages, and this kind of goes back to what you're saying. Like, I think it's fine to play Kelsey and Saquon on a team like this. Like, you've got so many low owned guys, and that's just some product thing. Like, you don't have to worry about being unique when you have. This might even be more than you need in terms of the amount of really low owned players.
You also wonder with that build where they started, where they finished. Like, you hit Baker, Robbie, Chase, Dolphins D in the early games, and you have all this. You have a lot of flexibility to play around with. They could have started there with Barkley and Jefferson and Kelsey and Tunyon, or they could have moved pieces around and just like jammed in chalk after hitting all that stuff.
Yeah, just let me play the optimal at this point. Looks like it's a single entry, so I don't know. I think that this might have been someone who just ran super pure. Here's a high MME guy, like, just kind of looking at what he did, and he plays the Mahomes double, does not bring it back. But this is a good example why it was a tough week, though, because this is a pretty chalky team overall. He's a little bit different at running back, and going cheap, like getting different at running. There were 2 ways to get different in my mind. One was to go cheap like he did, and the wide receiver firepower hits, and it only forces you into like 1 wide receiver punt. The other way was to, like, I had a JT team that was like really close to being a strong start, where I got, and CSU Rams talked about this on Wake and Rake. So JT gave me sort of like leverage over CMC at the same price point, and then also leverage on Pittman, but Pittman ends up, scoring with CMC or scoring with JT. Those were kind of the 2 ways to get different at running back.
Yeah. And the other thing I'd note is that lineup you're commenting on that lineup, like not having a bring back. I think when you have the expensive doubles and the bring back options that you would potentially play are expensive as well, it's more okay to not bring it back in that situation.
That's where
you're putting so much pressure on the rest of your lineup, like, especially when it's a chalk like Marquise Brown. Now, if I was to bring back anything on this, like Connor, but you might not have been able to fit that. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, And that's where like small field, I still think I would bring it back, but like large field, I don't think you have to. And that's where I mentioned I really wanted to play Jefferson this week. But for me, if I'm playing this, I didn't play this because I couldn't play the Mahomes doubles because it was too chalky given my starts. But I would have played Marquise Brown, and that cost you Jefferson.
Yeah.
There's just the math doesn't work. It costs you Jefferson as a one-off uncorrelated play. And that was a real struggle, even not even in hindsight, but while building the lineups, I specifically was like, I don't have Jefferson, but like I can't play him if I'm playing these stacks.
Yeah.
Oh, I should note too, I meant to note this at the top of the show, but like apologies for the lack of like FanDuel stuff. We don't have CSV, so it's a little bit harder to look at the ownership stuff there. And also, just quite frankly, I was traveling this week and I just stuck to one site. But next week I'll have some FanDuel teams to go over as well. Drew, why don't you talk a little bit MME in terms of making rules and what you were thinking going into this slate there?
Yeah. So I'll zoom in on this screen a little bit as well. But we had talked about, someone had asked, can you share some of the rules that you make on the Opto side as well? And so I'll go through kind of what I was thinking and how I went through stuff. You can see I use higher end range of outcomes and volatility. This is through the Fantasy Labs optimizer. Whatever optimizer you choose to use will have something along the lines of this. I tend to ramp it up because I want a little bit more of a spread of players. I just don't want all the same players kind of clumping in the same lineups together. And then I set some position limits. I wanted max 20% quarterback, max 25% tight end, and max 15% defense. I'm generally trying to spread those positions a little bit. Sometimes I'll adjust these. Defense, I'm almost always keeping around this level. I just generally don't want to be all in on like one defense. Would have been helpful if I was yesterday because it was the Dolphins defense that I was in on and the Bears, but I just generally, it's a position that's very hard to predict. I do allow tight end and flex, especially on a slate where it was pretty tight pricing wise. And then max own, I kept to 120, and I allow one player versus the defense, which you'll see in the rules that I created here. I was stacking everybody with at least one pass catcher with the exception of Trey Lance. I didn't feel the need to stack him. I also lowered my Lance exposure a lot at the end, so that rule kind of ended up being null. I don't want a quarterback with the running back on the same team generally. I know it can work, but it's just generally not the way that I'm trying to play to hit the absolute nuts. These teams, I was stacking double stacks: Burrow, Cousins, Carr, Mahomes, Herbert, Tua. Any of those I was stacking in doubles. I don't want my quarterback stacked with my defense. I think that limits upside generally. And then I did stuff like, I would pair the D with exactly 0 of quarterback, running back, tight end, meaning I'd allow a wide receiver against my defense, but not positions that are very touchdown dependent, right? So on DraftKings, a wide receiver can still get there with your defense going ham because they're getting bonuses and whatnot. And then I limit to at most 2 skill players, and overall in 2, at most 1, unless they're paired with a quarterback or the opposing quarterback. Most one running back from the same team. And then, those were basically the things I had in there. I did some correlation stuff where I tried to make sure that I wasn't overexposed to combinations of high-priced players. Like if I had Eckler, I didn't want Mike Williams and Keenan Allen. I thought those stacks would get really expensive if I was doing that. Similarly, like some teams, if I had their running back, I didn't want their wide receivers and stuff like that.
I was curious if you did that with the Philly guys.
The Philly guys, I didn't because I didn't have Goff in my player pool, and I didn't allow a running back with a quarterback overall. So
could you have had Sanders and AJ Brown?
No, because I didn't. Okay. If I had Goff in my player pool, I could, but because I have this rule of limit to at most 1 running back, I couldn't. Gotcha. So I would only have them coming back in game stacks. And then I did some like group stuff where I was just like cognizant of, obviously this was not a great rule. At most 1 of Swift, Amon-Ra, St. Brown. I didn't have doubles coming back on Detroit with my Hurt stacks, which hurt. And then I had this one custom rule where I want at least 2 players with projected ownership less than 7% from not including my defense. I don't care that my defense is below 7%. But I want to make sure I'm getting a skill player or a quarterback with below 7% ownership and getting a couple of those guys. And that gets into the product ownership stuff that we're talking about. And then just if you looked like at player pool, just to give an example. Oh, and I optimize off of ceiling and whatnot. But if you go off like player pool and whatnot, you can see I have, I'll sort by ceiling here. You can see I have some players selected and others not selected. And then I do flames and stuff or adjust ceiling projections or different things to manage my pool exposure. That's basically because I'm coming in with an idea of what I want my portfolios to look like. And I'm trying to work the optimizer in that general direction. And so sometimes I have to boost or dampen projections to kind of get there. And so you'll see me do some of that stuff. But you can see I wasn't using Aaron Rodgers, wasn't using Mariota. Tannehill. I wasn't using a lot of the lower end. No Baker Mayfield for me, so I couldn't win $1 million. I had Daniel Jones as my cheap quarterback, along with Winston. I included as well, and then I had Trey Lance, but I started toning him down quite a bit towards the end. But you can see I went through each position. I was saying that I wasn't going to play any Najee Harris, so I unchecked him, which I realized I need to scroll up a little bit more there. I unchecked Najee. Didn't play Josh Jacobs at all. Like I was just trying to manage guys' ceiling, and I didn't have Cordarrelle Patterson checked. I had him unchecked until Tyler Algier was inactive. And when Tyler Algier was inactive, I went back in and I made sure to check him and made sure I was overweight the field on him because I was like, oh, there's a clearer path here to volume, and he got fortunate in Damian Williams getting hurt very early. But you can see that in tight ends, I had a very limited tight end pool in terms of what I was choosing from, right? Like. Yeah, I wasn't playing a lot of these punt type guys. The punts that I played with Irv Smith, who gave me the 0 that you all desire at punt, and then Everett and Mo Alley Cox. Those are the cheap guys. Otherwise, I was generally spending at tight end on the slate.
Yeah, it was a tough scene for some of the. I was just thinking the Irv Smith 0 in my head. I went to the Devonta Smith 0 and then to the Mike Williams 3-point game with Keenan Allen getting hurt. Those mid-tier receivers. Those were some
positions that I had, so that it was a tough day for me, even in MME. Where I thought I had some good stuff, but and then defense, I don't uncheck anybody. If I get defense, I will max. Like Washington, we had projected for a decent bit of ownership, so I max them. But that's generally how I went through it.
And then you brought up ceiling. If I'm playing like chalkier guys in MME or really anywhere. The big thing for me is ceiling, and you can see Jefferson, Chase, Adams, Kelsey, 4 highest ceiling projections. Obviously, they were expensive at their positions, but they smash, and that's where you can see okay, I can. And when I'm doing my own, I have my own sheet that I do to kind of help me identify plays to combine this stuff, and I had Chase and Jefferson popping there, and Kelsey to an extent too, just because the ceiling was so good.
Yeah.
We did kind of whiff on the Saquon ceiling. The math didn't like him. I talked about him as bad chalk on Wake and Rake on FanDuel, and the math really didn't like the Saquon ceiling. Obviously, we've seen that Saquon is back, and that's what's hard with the pure math based approach at times. But that was one we whiffed on in terms of ceiling. At the running back position.
Yeah, he was back in terms of not only looking really efficient, but and running really efficiently, but also the workload. And the workload was the stuff that I think it was hard to. It's hard when you have history on your side to try to make projections. It's kind of hard to go too far away from history. But all the stuff about the receivers and whatnot started to make it there's something here that I thought could be really, really high.
Yeah, and we gave him a really high. Most of the ceiling stuff was just related to kind of a dusty game environment and his efficiency historically, not lining up with our perception of his skill more so than it was a workload thing. All right, I think that's pretty much it for this week's GPP recap. Hopefully the chalk stumbles into some trouble next week and we can have a more satisfying recap. But always good to go through and sort of learn best ways to approach things, makes adjustments if necessary. So appreciate everybody tuning in, and best of luck next week.